So today's talk, kindly got Liz to come back and talk about her latest book. She came, I remember many months ago when she came down to us near the bridge and talked about her first book. So that's a while ago. But she's now got one, Love and Music Had We Never Loved So Blindly, which has just been published. And she's going to talk to us now about it and the background to it, etc., etc. So if you can mute yourselves if you're going to be noisy, and I'll hand you over to Liz to talk about her book.
Right, okay, thank you. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yes.
Yes?
Yep.
Yes.
Yeah. Yes, okay. Yes, it's lovely to be asked back again. Yes, thank you very much. And yes, it was a while ago, but I think at some point I spoke about my second book possibly, but I've lost track. Anyway, yes, Had We Never Loved So Blindly? And I'm sure, you know, most people will know that the source of the quotation there's Robert Burns from A. von Kiss. I always have a lot of difficulty choosing book titles. What I thought I'd do, incidentally, is talk for a bit and then open it up for questions, if that suits everyone. And try not to talk for too long. You remember the minister's prayer, and he was preparing his sermon, Lord, fill my head with good stuff and tell me when I've said enough, which I think is pretty good advice. And Robert Burns, of course, was well known for his multiple relationships with various women, his complicated love life. And during his short life of 37 years, he composed hundreds of poems and songs in honor of the women he admired. And A. von Kiss was written in honor of Mrs. Agnes Macaloys. They wrote to each other using sort of Greek pseudonyms, calling themselves Clarissa and Lysander. Unusually for Burns, the relationship seems to have been a platonic one. And in the end, she left for Edinburgh to go to the West Indies and meet up with her estranged husband. So that's the source of it. I've also got, interestingly, another link with A. von Kiss, because for many years we lived in Warwickshire, in Nuneaton in North Warwickshire, and it was the birthplace of George Eliot, but also of Ken Loach, the radical filmmaker. And he actually made a film called A. von Kiss, along with his more famous one of Cathy Come Home and so on. So there's a sort of connection there. The ideas behind my writing come very much from sort of family history, because my mother was born on Skye and but lived most of her adult life in England after marrying an English naval officer after the Second World War. But I spent all my summer holidays with my grandparents on Skye and very much sort of imbibed the stories and the music. And I was absolutely entranced by Skye, as I know many people are. It's such a huge contrast from the south of England where I normally lived. So I'm very pleased to be back with my roots. And all the books are a sort of product, really, of my love of the island. This one, though, feels more personal than the others, probably because it's in the 20th century rather than the 19th. And it all started with a postcard, one of those old black and white ones. And this was a postcard of Glasgow with Welcome to Glasgow in the middle and a bunch of lucky heather. And it was sent to my mother in 1942 with a very brief address, Caerlaughlacalch, Rossshire. And it reached her where she was working in the Kyle Hotel, which during the war was taken over by the Navy and became HMS Trelawney. Why they gave it a Cornish name rather than a Highland name, I don't know, but HMS Trelawney it was. And I knew it was significant because she wasn't at all sentimental. She didn't keep things. And the back of it was, I hope you're keeping well. I'm in my usual. I'm having a fine holiday. I'm expecting to join a ship tomorrow, Tuesday, deep sea. I will write to you when I get settled down. Hope to see you in a few months. Until then, I remain your loving brother, John Alec. So it was my uncle who was working as a fisherman with my grandfather and grandfather's two brothers. And he'd no need to join up. He was in a reserved occupation. And in addition, he was short-sighted. So he was turned down by the army and then by the Navy. So he decided to sign up as a merchant seaman. To the anguish of my granny, he was the middle child of 5 and the only son. And like many people, of course, of her age, she'd lived through the First War when all her brothers went off to fight, and one of them didn't come back. So I don't know if he also sent a postcard to my grandparents or if things were still a little bit raw there, and he didn't. But the theme of young men being determined to fight despite not being sort of A1 in health terms is an interesting one. The writer Rudyard Kipling used his influence to get his son a posting in the First War, although his son had poor eyesight. And then when his son was missing, he was devastated with guilt and wrote the poem My Son Jack about him. And I've seen a couple of programs on television where sort of antique roadshow type programs where people have had items like binoculars that were adjusted for short sight. And they belonged, and flying goggles in one occasion, and they belonged to young men who managed to sort of get past the eyesight test because again, they were determined obviously to fight. The Merchant Navy is, I suppose, a bit of a neglected service. They remained as civilians, but had the highest death rate of any of the services in the Second World War, because so many, of course, were involved in very dangerous convoy duties. And 25%, it's reckoned, died in enemy action, were wounded or taken prisoner. And the other incredible thing is until May 1941, surviving merchant seamen on British vessels destroyed by enemy action received no pay from the moment they were torpedoed, and time spent in open boats until they were rescued was considered non-working time, and they weren't paid for it, which seems to me absolutely horrific. So my book, in a sense, is something of a tribute to those brave men. But I was also very aware of how John Norman, one of the two main characters, was in a very male environment, and I wanted a different sort of voice to balance that. So the story alternates between him and the other main character, a young woman called Felicity, very different, the upper class daughter of a retired tea planter. And the idea was their contrasting backgrounds and experiences would broaden the story and add the tension that every novel needs, really. So they meet first as teenagers on Skye, very unlikely heroes, both gawky adolescents with poor eyesight, which they feel blights their lives, and both in different ways led very narrow lives. John Norman scarcely left the island, while Felicity had the sort of limited education that was given to upper class girls who were expected to marry well rather than have a career. So in a sense, war gave them wider opportunities. And upper class young women who were good at languages were of course recruited by Bletchley Park. And so that's the second storyline really. And it seemed a good idea, and I think it was, but it was an absolute nightmare trying to write it, because it's juggling sort of parallel lives. They meet up, they correspond by letter, and then, you know, it deals with both of them separately, and making sure the timings all sort of fitted together was quite a tricky proposition. Now, if I may, I'll just read a little bit from the beginning of the book. And this is when they first meet in 1937. And it's, to put it mildly, not an auspicious meeting. So this is the Isle of Skye, 1937. He heaved himself up on the pedals of the heavy bike, his arms trembling as he tried to steer. "Are you sure you can manage, John Norman?" Mr. Gillis frowned as he looked at the laden basket. "Oh, aye, sir, I help Papa haul in the nets and the rest of it." He pushed his glasses back up his nose. "Well, see how you do, lad." John Norman decided to get rid of the biggest order first. It meant he had to strain uphill till Kilveckin House out of the village. But no matter how hard he pressed down on the pedals, he couldn't get any speed up. He looked behind him, and as there was no one to notice, he dismounted and pushed the bike. Wiping his sweaty brow on the sleeve of his jacket, he plodded on till he reached the long drive. The century pines lining the path protected him from the northwesterly wind as he crunched along the gravel. Mr. Gillis had been very firm about him taking his delivery round the back, so he wheeled his bike away from the shiny black front door and around the side. A new section had been built onto the house, making the short part of a letter L. It looked dingier than the rest of the house, he thought, as he knocked on the scuffed door. A flustered-looking middle-aged woman in white apron appeared. John Norman touched his cap. "I've brought the delivery from Lipton's, ma'am." "Oh, I bring it in then." She half turned and called out, "I'll be with you in a moment, miss. The lad from Lipton's has just arrived." She waved an impatient hand at him, pointing at a big table in the middle of the kitchen. He set down the box before handing the list of items. He could see the slender back of a girl standing in front of the oven. "I'm going to open it to see how it's doing," she said in a loud English voice that sounded like a crow calling. "No, miss, you'll make the cake sink." "Oh, very well." The girl sounded peevish. They both ignored John Norman, who felt foolish holding out his list. He cleared his throat and put the bill down on the table before turning to leave. After all, he'd loads more to deliver. At that moment, the inner door opened. "Oh, what's going on here? Something smells good." A tall man with a booming voice came in. "Mrs. Patterson was helping make a sponge cake, but this boy interrupted us." She flicked her hair in John Norman's direction, making her long dark red hair ripple. He could feel his face reddening. It wasn't him who'd upset the cook. Surely she knew you spoilt a cake if you opened the oven door early. The man waved the papers in his hand. "I thought it was time for a cup of tea. I've been busy checking the latest tea prices." "Oh, there's no need to check them, sir. Mr. Gillis has written all the prices down for you here." All three turned to stare at him. Mrs. Patterson frowned and the girl curled her lip. The man widened his eyes before throwing his head back and roaring with laughter. "Oh, I don't mean the tea price from Lipton's, young man. I was talking about the tea prices from our estate in India." The girl started giggling, and John Norman could feel his face heating up like a furnace. If only he'd kept his mouth shut. He looked down at his boots. The laughter seemed to go on forever, but finally the man quietened down. "Well, no harm done, and you've cheered me up. It's a tedious job looking at rows of figures. You must be tired after cycling out from Portree. Give him a glass of milk, Mrs. Patterson. What's your name, young man?" John Norman told him while the cook sniffed and went off to fetch his drink. Macpherson, you say? Oh, there's quite a few of you in this neck of the woods. I'm a MacDougall myself, and this fine young filly is my daughter Felicity. We've been out in India, but we're home now. Got a place down in London, of course, as well as here. We're up for the summer, while Felicity goes to Switzerland to be finished. John Norman nodded. He sensed Felicity staring at him, ready to pounce. He wouldn't be made a fool of a second time. He had no idea what being finished meant, and he didn't care. Still, he was all in favour if it meant she'd be finished off in some way. All he wanted to do was down the glass of milk that had been thrust into his hand and escape as soon as he could. So that's the starting story. And I realized it was quite dangerous writing what in part is a love story, because I feared, well, someone asked me if it was a romance, and I thought, oh, goodness, no. And, envisaged Mills and Boon and Barbara Cartland, if you remember her in those pink sort of puffball dresses that she used to wear. So it's not it's no way that it's a romance, but at the heart of the story is a relationship between two contrasting characters, and we see the war through the prism of their relationship and their different social circles. And it would be easy to imagine that Skye was on the fringes of the war. It wasn't really. I've mentioned how the Kyle Hotel became HMS Trelawney and was the headquarters of the 1st Mine Laying Squadron. And trains transported mines from Durinish, a few miles away on the railway. And there was an army camp on the island, a radar location post, a Royal Observer Corps had stations. And Mary Carmichael writes in her book, The Crofters and the War, pivotal to the work of these bases was the identification of enemy aircraft and submarines, the communication of vital information and the protection of the coast and convoys. War had indeed come to the Crofters, and this was the West Coast's front line. Security was very tight and access to the west of Scotland carefully controlled. Railway travellers from Inverness had to present their travel passes at Achnasheen before they were allowed to continue onwards. And one of the themes of the book is the corrosive effects of secrets, both personal ones and ones of national importance. And of course, the atmosphere of secrecy in the wartime, walls of ears, as the famous slogan goes. And episodes of what we nowadays call friendly fire, which is a terrible term, I think. In other words, tragic mistakes when damage is done to your own side, were obviously kept as quiet as possible because they were so damaging for morale. And anyone who asked too many questions, like Felicity's communist friend Bertha, would be treated with huge suspicion. And a tragic example of this sort of episode that quite possibly you know about was the loss of the HMS Curaçao, a cruiser deployed as an escort ship on the South Atlantic convoys. And she was due to meet and accompany the liner, the Queen Mary, to port. And the Queen Mary had been fitted out as a troop ship and was carrying 15,000 American troops aboard. And on October the 2nd, about 20 miles off the coast of Donegal, the watch aboard the Curaçao thought he sighted an enemy submarine. And after giving the warning, the escort misjudged, unfortunately, the speed of the liner when it made a zigzag passage across. And the Queen Mary crashed into this smaller ship, felt the impact, but the captain couldn't stop. He didn't dare take the risk of stopping in case there were enemy submarines about. So he steamed onto the Firth of Clyde. And of the 342 crew aboard the Curaçao, 338 were lost. Some of the bodies came with the tides and washed ashore on Skye, and 17 are buried at Ashak in the south of the island. Local people and the relatives of the dead men, of course, knew what had happened, but otherwise the episode was kept secret. And secrecy was, of course, carefully guarded at Bletchley Park, where employees signed the Official Secrets Act, and many of them kept silence about their wartime work for the rest of their lives. You can't imagine people managing to do that nowadays with social media and so on, to keep such important things secret. So my book comes under the banner of historical fiction, based on thorough historical research, and very different, I suppose, from fictionalized history like The Crown, which is on TV, and I know very enjoyable, but portrays the past through distorting mirrors and has dialogue that no one, can know if it could have happened or not. So that's the book, really. I hope it's sort of given you a little bit of a flavour, and I think it's probably a good idea if I stop talking there. I've said enough, and I'm very open to any questions or any observations people would like to make.
Well, I'll start because I have read the book, Liz, and I
Right.
thoroughly enjoyed it.
Good.
And I thought the characters were really lifelike and I could relate to them. And also, of course, the places that within Portree and on Skye and locally. So I really thoroughly enjoyed it. But, well, I think the difficult, but then, of course, you always want to know what happens next in these things. I know it's not a serialization, but
no.
I wondered if you thought about writing a sequel to it.
Well, it's interesting, Christine. Several people have said that, and I have sort of toyed with the idea, but it would have to come quite far forward into more recent times, and I'm not sure how I feel about that, really, because there could be a sequel. You're right. So at the moment, no. I now and then think about it when I'm taking the dog out for a walk, but not at the moment.
Well,
I haven't ruled it out.
I have not read the book, Liz, but I can simply tell you, we were away at the time, we were on Isla, and I couldn't get anything from Chris for ages while she was reading this blessed book.
Right.
So
oh, well, I take it that's a recommendation.
So I was having to do my own scrambled eggs and everything. So actually, I nearly fell out of love with you during the process.
Oh, that's lovely. Yes. Yeah. Well, thank you very much.
I am a bit of a bookworm, so yeah. Sorry, Eileen.
Hi, Liz. I'm in the middle of reading the book. Robert bought it for me back on Monday, so I'm only halfway through yet. But I was very interested in what you said about the Bletchley thing, because I was down in Broadwood Hospital 2 years back, and the lady in the bed next door to me was from Lochcarron, and she had been working at Bletchley.
Really?
And that was basically all she would tell. She was quite elderly, but she was telling, her daughter says, she'll tell you that, but nothing else. She was, again, the same sort of idea, a lady who had been brought up with privilege and could speak different languages. And basically that's what she did it down in Bletchley. So your character ties in brilliantly to to an actual person who lives, I don't know if she's still there, but lived across in Strathcarron.
Yes, well, that's fascinating. Yes, because that generation, of course, is dying out, but so many of them didn't say anything, or sometimes they did right at the end of their lives, and of course the family knew nothing about it and wanted to know more, but they took the Official Secrets Act very, very seriously.
Robert and I have actually visited Bletchley. We went there on a visit when we were down south a few years back, and it's a fascinating place. The actual places that it still is today. But even then, there's a list of people who did work there, but that's because 30 years after they're allowed to tell you.
Indeed. Yeah, I mean, I think it's amazing that it's survived. Thank goodness. It could all have been knocked down. And I don't know if other people have been there, but the original Bletchley Park house is a sort of hideous Edwardian monstrosity of a house. And then all, huge numbers of huts, and very, very well explained. It's an interesting place to go to if you're ever down that way. I suppose Milton Keynes is the nearest sort of town to it. So yes.
When it first opened, we went with a local history group there, and the lady who took us round had worked there. She must have been in her 70s or maybe 80, I don't know. And she was saying that they worked in one hut, and the secrecy was such that they would do all their work and it all be bundled up, and they would be given to this dispatch rider at the door who would go off, etc., etc. And they assumed that all this stuff was going to go to somewhere like Derby or Edinburgh, somewhere like that. And she only found out many, many years later that it just went to the next hut next door. And she was unaware.
Yes. Yeah, and they weren't allowed to communicate between the huts. I mean, they had quite an active social life, and various sort of clubs and orchestras and goodness knows what, but you weren't supposed to mix on a work basis with people in other huts. So yes, I mean, quite amazing that it was kept so well under wraps for so long, I think. Yeah. Yes. I've got a nice little poem I found in obituary recently of someone who worked at Bletchley Park, which you might like. And this was Ellen Elizabeth Reed. And she said she was recruited to Bletchley in 1939. And they put on plays and skits and things. And she wrote this thing. We've brains and we've beauty. We work at the park. We're there for the duty and we're there for the lark. My chief's a professor, my don's over 40, and my dear old colonel's too old to be naughty. So what is the use of our loveliness when there are no full-blooded men, no full-blooded men? That was rather nice. And I just put that to music, I think, a style of Gilbert and Sullivan. But yes, yeah.
So do you find it easier or better, more enjoyable to write sort of historical fiction rather than a more fact-based material?
Yes, I suppose so. I mean, I did a history degree, and yes, I obviously, enjoy the subject, but I suppose I never felt that I wanted to do the huge amount of endless research you have to do sort of real historical writing. I mean, I do a lot for what I do, but I can sort of pick and choose. And I suppose what always interested me when I was learning history, and the teachers I had, some were very good and made it come alive, and they made it human, and there's the anecdotes, and that's what sort of really gripped me. Others left it very sort of dry and tedious and so on. And I suppose it was the stories and the sort of oral history side of things, and the stories that I heard when I was up in Skye as a child, because it's only recently really that the sort of more oral history has been documented. I think that started in the 60s when it was realized that the people who survived the First World War were dying off, and they'd have to get their memories down before it was too late. And I think it was looked on as a bit as sort of second best compared to the documentary stuff. But of course, since then, oral history is recognized in its own right, and it's no more or less reliable than written sources. I mean, you think of the reliability of politicians' memoirs, for example. So it was always that sort of, human interest side of it, I think, that gripped me. So which is why I've gone down the fiction route, which gives you a little bit more freedom, although, you have to do it properly, of course. Yeah.
It's a bit of a coincidence, but last week, thanks to Bill there, we visited the RAF radar facility.
Oh, right. Oh, very good.
Bill's done a whole load of research, and one of the interesting things, taking your point about oral history, that one of our members, her mother, who's basically from Skye, her mother and father used to run a cafe in the Second World War in Portree Harbour, and the RAF personnel used to frequent the cafe, she was telling us. And it's just direct contact, really, you know.
Yes.
With that sort of history, it brought it quite a bit alive, really.
It does very much so. And I was talking to someone from Rasay after I did my launch, and she was saying that all her aunts and uncles and so on joined up, and one of the aunts was in the ATS, and she got rare leave, and of course to get back to Rasay was really difficult, and the steamer couldn't dock properly because it was so stormy. So her aunt, with all her kit bag and wearing the full uniform and greatcoat and everything, had to jump from ship to pier. And this was someone who couldn't swim, and if she'd mistimed it, it would have been curtains, you know, she'd have been trapped between the boat and the, you know. And I mean, I think people of that generation were just so hardy and made so light of it, you know. Absolutely amazing. I mean, the book in part is a tribute to my dad, who was in the Navy, and he was on the Malta convoy that got through to the island when most of the ships were blasted to smithereens. And you know, imagining what on earth that must have been like, you know, attacked from underneath and above, and really, you know, we just can't imagine how it was. And people
My
just.
father was actually on Malta. He was in the Navy, and he
Oh,
was
was he?
Malta.
Right. Ah, yes.
I was telling the others about the Official Secrets Act. His ship, it was the first ship in the war to be sunk by a magnetic mine, but he didn't know that until the 1970s. They were told it was a sort of chance. Well, they were told it was two torpedoes from two U-boats would come up alongside on either side and both fire, which is a bit far-fetched, but that's what they were told. And so he only knew when my brother and I watched the documentary on TV about the secrets coming out, and they said that the Magdeburg was the first ship to be sunk. And we all knew his story about
oh my
sunk
goodness.
on the Magdeburg.
Yes.
Yeah. But
yes,
he had to go up. He was given leave to go up to Scotland. He lived in my grandfather was in the Trossachs, and they were told not to tell anyone. So he had this sort of great story about having to go up, you know, to get home, wearing borrowed pajamas and a seaman's jumper, and he kept getting stopped because he didn't have any papers, and people didn't believe that he was, you know, a Navy officer. Because it hadn't come out. But when he got home, everyone was in mourning because they'd heard that the Magdeburg had gone down and they hadn't heard from him, so they assumed he was dead.
Right, gosh, what a story, yes.
Yeah, it's all into a big joke. I mean, it must have been horrendous, but yeah, it was all, you know, one of his amusing stories. Yeah.
Yes, and I think that's what people did, didn't they? They turned them into stories, but yeah, but it's that sort of detail and story that makes history come alive, I think. Yeah, very much so. Yes, yeah.
So you're writing a book at the moment, are you?
Yes, I've sort of got two kind of partial ones. One sort of First World War, and the other one going right back to the Iron Age. And I'm finding that really quite tricky because, well, it's so difficult to get into the mindset of such a different time. So I'm doing both of those, but I find I had to put them on a back burner because, well, I'm sort of, you know, trying to do the marketing side of things. I just haven't got enough space in my head to be creative. And I mean, it's interesting. I think, you know, I couldn't write much when I was sort of working full time. Again, I think for the same reason, really. I think you've got to have the space and the time to let your mind sort of float free, really. So yes, I have got other ones that are waiting. But what will happen, I don't know. I mean, some writers plan the whole story in advance. Oh, we're getting some feedback. Are you okay? Is that all right? It's getting feedback. Yes.
Yeah.
And I always assume that people who write sort of detective stories, for example, would have it all plotted, you know, and have great plans and things written out. But when Ian Rankin came to talk at the Sky Book Festival, someone asked him that, and he said, "No, I don't plan anything." He said, "I don't even know at the beginning who's going to be the murderer and who's going to be the victim," which I found, you know, incredibly interesting, because I wouldn't have imagined you could do that, you know. But yes, so, you know, people do things in different ways, I suppose. But I think there's quite an element of a sort of unconscious process goes on, as well as the thinking part of it, because I think things just pop into your mind and characters start arguing in my head. I mean, it makes me sound a bit as if I've got schizophrenia saying this, but you know, I think things do evolve. It's not always a thought out conscious process, and I've heard other people, you know, say something similar, so that's how it goes. I'm
fascinated. Do you have a particular time of the day or a particular discipline when you write?
When I'm writing, I try and do a little bit most days. That just because that works for me, because little and often, and then I'll sort of look at what I've done the day before, you know, change it round and do a bit more. But I guess there's as many ways of doing it as there are people. But I find just the kind of trying to keep some sort of momentum going, because when you start off, I mean, the thought of you know, 80,000 words or whatever is an awful lot, and just doing a couple of hundred at a time, you know, just keeps it ticking over. But, you know, some people I know just lock themselves away and just write all the time, which I don't think I could do. I couldn't suspend normal life completely. So, you know, I think there's as many ways as there are people, probably. Yeah.
That's
interesting.
interesting.
Do you do all your research beforehand, or
sorry?
Do you do all your research? Do you do all your research beforehand?
I do a bit. Then... I do a bit, but I think that's another trap, really, because it's easy to think, oh, I'll just do a bit more research. You know, procrastination is is all too easy, really. So I do a bit about the basics, and then I sort of start it, and then because in a way you don't always know what you need to know until you're writing it. And going back to what you were saying about restrictions about being on Sky, I mean, I kind of knew about that, but I didn't know the details of how it worked. So when I got to that, you know, when I got to that point in the story, I then had to sort of check that out. And of course, some things are quite difficult like that to check out, and you can only do it by asking people rather than looking things up. So I sort of mix and match with the two, I suppose. And Portree Library, we know when it's open, is absolutely brilliant. Their local history section is amazing. They've got a copy of every book, I think, that's been printed about the local history of Skye. So that's really good. And the few they haven't got, they will, you know, they will bring in. So that is a wonderful resource to have. You know, it couldn't be better.
Do you stick with one publisher?
No, the first one was the Islands Book Trust, Love and Music Will Endure. And then after, they're a very, very small publisher. So after that, I moved to a bigger one. And I've stuck with John Hunt since, who have, you know, have been pretty good. Because, well, I mean, that's another whole different ball game, of course. Trying to get a book published is you know, is an uphill struggle. I mean, I think you know, there's now more books being published all the time than there ever have been, you know, in history, and not so many people reading, although people have rediscovered reading with the you know, with COVID and lockdown. So things are maybe changing, you know. That could be one of the more positive outcomes from it. I don't know. But yes, it's yes, I mean, it's a strange thing, because writing, you need, I suppose, one set of skills and fairly introverted ones, and then you come to sort of publishing and publicizing, and you have to have a quite different set of, you know, more outgoing skills. So it's an odd sort of mixture, really, an odd sort of thing to do, I have to say. Yeah. I don't know if that sort of answers your question.
Okay.
I was
Did
going
anyone?
to ask, could I ask, how many copies do you print to start off with?
Well, these days, because printing can be, in theory, fairly instantaneous, most publishers do smallish numbers and then keep topping up, which is, you know, different from how it used to be in the past. So I think the short answer to that is, you know, quite a lot are printed to begin with, but not vast numbers, because they just keep, you know, redoing it. Because now everything is sort of digital, I think it's much easier to do that, you know.
I think that change has happened quite recently too, hasn't it? The last 10, 15 years?
I would think so, yes. Yeah, I know it. By the time I brought the first book out, it had changed, and they said that's how they do it. So it sort of makes it, yeah, it should, in theory, streamline the system. Although I've been sort of waiting, it should have been 2 weeks for a new stash of books to come, and there've been delays, including them being sent to the wrong place. So, you know, it's not necessarily foolproof, like things aren't really. Yeah. But I mean, I think ebooks have sort of died a death a bit. It was said that they would replace real books, but I think there's some numbers have stabilized of those, because there's all sorts of snags with them, I think, really. I mean, there's nothing that beats holding a real book, and, you know, it's got a smell of a book, I think. But yeah. Would it be helpful to mention, if people want to get copies of my book, where they can get them from? Would that be a useful thing to say? There's a lot of places on Sky stock them, as you might imagine. Carmina Gadelica in Portree does, McIntyre's does, the Post Office, Inga Sweets has got a couple of copies. In the south of the island, Uncrew stocks it. Skylark in Armadale does. Dunvegan Castle. And online, obviously Amazon, but I know a lot of folk, quite understandably, don't like Amazon. And also W.H. Smith and Waterstones also stock it online. So those are all possible. Also, if you'd like a copy from me and I can sign it, real signing, not electronic. It retails at £12.99, but if you get it directly from me, it'd be £10, including the postage. So that's another possibility. So for anyone who's interested in that, my email address is Liz Macrae Shaw, all lowercase, and it's LizMacraeshaw, and that's at outlook.com. So that gives a few options.
I'll circulate it to everyone.
That would be lovely. Thank you very much. Yes. Yeah. Yes. Yeah.
Good.
Well, it's been it's been fascinating talking to you, and as always, it's the getting the stories from other people.
Mm.
You know, that is an amazing thing. Yeah, I mean, that happens a lot with the first book, because Mary Macpherson was a local, albeit, you know, the 19th century one, and all the stories that came up from that was absolutely amazing. But it's, you know, and it's continued with this one, so that's great. Yeah, so thank you very much for being such an attentive audience.
Well, thank you. And
I miss the tea. I miss the tea and chat of a real meeting, I have to say.
But we all.
Yeah, I'm sure. But, you know, having said that, I mean, Zoom has been a lifesaver, hasn't it, really?
Yeah.
And, you know, can't fault it. And, you know, that's good. And thank you, Ian, for sharing everything. And
yeah, we've recorded it so that those members who weren't here can log in afterwards, and we can give you the link to it or whatever, and see if you're interested.
Right. Oh, that's great. Yes, thank you. Yeah. So what's your next meeting going to be?
I think isn't it? Is it your daughter, Joe? Unmute. She's on mute. I think her daughter is.
Unmute. That would make a difference.
Yes, right.
That would help. Yes, my daughter Mary. She's got a busy life, but she's got it in her diary for next time. So hopefully she'll come and talk to us. But she does training. She does training all year round. She does these ultra marathons. Well, not ultra marathons.
Oh my goodness, gosh.
The big ones, but not Ironman type things. She does Keltman, for example.
Right.
I don't know if you've heard of that, where you sort of swimming in the loch for quite a distance, and then a bike ride over the hills, and then a marathon with a couple of Munros thrown in type thing.
Gosh, well, good for her. I mean, that's amazing. Yes.
The training of it is quite interesting as well. I don't know quite what she's going to cover, but she spends she trains every day of the year round.
Gosh, I can imagine.
Getting up early, swimming in the loch before work, and
yes.
I won't tell you much more because.
No, you don't want to spoil it. But no, the thought of swimming in a in a loch first thing in the morning, that's that's quite something. No, I haven't been tempted either. No. No, that sounds great.
Good.
Okay, that's for next month then.
Yes.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for listening. It's been a enjoyable experience, and all the best for the future.
Thank you, Liz. Thank you very much.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.